Noswaith dda pawb. Helo, shwai. A croeso i'r digwyddiad Gwyl Crime Cymru hwn. Evening everybody and welcome to Mystery in History, a Gwyl Crime Cymru Festival event, which we are able to bring you through the generous financial support of the Welsh Government. I really hope you're going to enjoy our chat about why the present isn't really doing it for us and why we had to look elsewhere for inspiration for our crime fiction. My name's Alice Hawkins, and like the other authors this evening, I write historical crime fiction. I write the Tyfi Valley Coroner series set in mid-19th century West Wales and the Oxford Mysteries set in 1880s Oxford. But this evening isn't about me, it's about our three guests. So I'm going to introduce them to be completely egalitarian in alphabetical order. So to start off with Chris Lloyd. Chris started his crime writing career, or crime fiction career, I should say, writing contemporary novels set in Catalonia and featuring the then independent Catalan police force. He's since moved his fiction to Paris under Nazi occupation with the Eddie Giral series, which features a Paris policeman doing his best to resist the Nazis and remain true to his values. The first in the series, The Unwanted Dead, won the Historical Writers Association Gold Crown. The second, Paris Requiem, was published last year and will be out in paperback in August. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, welcome. Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Leslie Scase, now living in Shropshire, was born and educated in South Wales and travelled widely across the UK during a career in the civil service. Leslie is the author of the Inspector Chard series, set in the late 19th century in both Pontypridd and Shropshire. There are currently 3 books in the series: Fortuna's Deadly Shadow, Fatal Solution, and the most recent, Sabrina's Teardrop. Welcome to you, Leslie.
Hi.
Andrew Taylor, our third author, has written nearly 50 books, 3 of which have been televised. He's won numerous awards in his distinguished career, including the Crime Writers Association Diamond Dagger and the Historical Writers Association Gold Crown. Books in his current Marwood and Lovett series set in Restoration London have consistently been Sunday Times bestsellers, and the paperback version of the most recent, The Shadows of London, was published earlier this year. Welcome, Andrew.
Welcome, thank you.
No problem. Right, now we've got everybody on screen. What we're going to do is we're going to chat for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll bring in the lovely Bev Jones, because she's going to monitor our YouTube channel for questions. So if you think of questions while we're talking, stick them in the chat function and Bev will wumble them up and bring them to us later on. Okay, so we've all chosen to look to the past for our fiction. So we obviously feel that there's something pulling us there, but perhaps we should be a bit objective for our listeners and talk about a bit about the pros and cons of writing historical fiction. So are there aspects of your period, attitudes or events that you find particularly difficult? Andrew, as the one whose time period is most removed from ours, do you want to kick us off with this?
Well, of course, I mean, the obvious thing about the 17th century is there's no police force, there's no forensic science, and the judicial system was very different from ours now. So basically, it's a completely different world, but fortunately, human nature hasn't changed a great deal. So we have that as a constant. I'm fascinated, though, by the way, despite the way the past is completely different from us, the lives are very different, you can still find these common features.
Absolutely. Chris, did you find it difficult to imbue the German characters in your series with humanity? Was that tough given everything we know about the Nazis now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a curious period to be writing about, because I mean, it did see the most debased act in human history, probably, and one of the most appalling passages of history. But I think the whole point, just as I tried to write Eddie as someone who is caught up in a situation, who is forced into finding his way between resistance and collaboration. So I think the Germans as well. I mean, there would have been a very, very broad church of motivations, of reasons why people supported Hitler, did not support Hitler. So basically, I mean, you go from the extreme members of the Nazi Party who believed in the racial ideology, who believed in the supremacy of the Aryan race and what have you. But then you went through there was a whole gamut of reasons why people joined, and some of them were just they wanted to right what they perceived as the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles, what happened after the First World War, the Civil War, the German uprising. And so it's I think there's a danger when you do write about the Nazis or write about Germans at this time, because of course there's also a differentiation to be made between Germans and Nazis at this time. It's very, very easy to write the comic book baddie with twirling the moustache and wearing the black hat and what have you. And yes, there were people like that, and an awful lot of people like that. But it's far more interesting to try and delve into other motivations, other reasons why people would get caught up in either the Nazi Party or in the German war effort or in the German military and in the various parts of the German military which fought against each other almost as much as they fought against the Allies. So I think it's trying to find a nuance within those people.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Leslie, you're writing about places that you know really well. Has that made it easier or harder to write historical fiction set in those places?
I think the difficulty for me, easy in many ways, because in the first two books, which are set in Pontypridd mainly, I am familiar with some of the old Victorian buildings that no longer exist because I remember them from my childhood. I think one of the problems in getting across perhaps is that people who are of a younger generation now, they see Pontypridd perhaps as this small market town that's basically a commuter area in the catchment of the city of Cardiff. It's not particularly booming. It's actually starting to get on the up again now, but it's not massive, you know. Whereas, and of course, the whole area since the 1970s has been rather deprived, the old South Wales Valleys area. And it's easy to forget that in the late 19th century in particular, the area was absolutely booming. We think now about 20% of the world's oil, the primary, obviously, industrial fuel, comes from Russia and America. They account for about 20%. Well, 25% of the prime industrial fuel in the world came from the Rhondda Valleys. It was massive. So I've got to try and create this imagery in the town of Pontypridd that it's got a fabulous ballroom. It's got innumerable hotels. It's got music halls. It's vibrant, and it's sometimes perhaps it's difficult to actually get that across, which hopefully I do, because what I wanted to do when I wrote these Victorian books, was to kind of take the thing away from London and Jack the Ripper and the East End and that whole sort of thing, which I think has been done to death, and sort of put it somewhere else. And nice place. But in terms of what's been said already, the people themselves were very much like us, with the same hopes and fears. You know, their big issues around addiction, their worries around abortion was a massive thing. And of course, you know, we've just been through COVID. Well, they felt the same thing when they had the typhoid and cholera. So they all felt the same things.
Absolutely. And I think writing historical fiction, I mean, we all know that famous L.P. Hartley quote, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. But if we don't see some kind of connection with the past, if the past is too foreign, then it's not going to be appealing to our readers, is it? So how do we deal with that difference, that being foreign? I mean, Andrew, I think your inspiration for The Shadows of London was something quite contemporary, wasn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, when I started planning the book, the Me Too crisis was developing, and people were quite rightly realizing the appalling things women had to put up with. And that focused my attention on the mistresses of Charles II. And in the past, I'd rather subscribe to the merry monarch myth of Charles II, coming back after the Restoration and being the king everyone loved, who liked to have a good time. But once you start researching his private life, it becomes increasingly sordid, increasingly manipulative, and, well, increasingly cruel in some ways to the women he drew into his life. I mean, I think he took it as his God-given right, almost. After all, he was the anointed, the God's anointed, as the King of England and Scotland and Ireland. So he could have what he wanted in this world. But what the case I particularly focused on was that of a young French aristocrat who was a virgin, who was half his age, and who he laid siege to. And it wasn't just him, because it was an affair of state as well. So the King of France was encouraging it. The French ambassador was, and even the Lord Arlington, who was effectively the prime minister at the time, because they thought it would be convenient to have a French woman in the king's bed, who would be a way to influence the king and also a source of information about his private thoughts. And basically, the king laid siege to this unfortunate young woman for a year, until at last she succumbed. Who can blame her, really?
I mean, she was given very little choice, was she? What other choice was there? She didn't have much. She didn't have many prospects in life, did she? And I thought you portrayed her really well, because she's there. She's this poor innocent, really, and all this political intrigue is just swirling around her. And that, because I knew that contemporary reference with the Me Too movement, it did make me think about some of the young starlets who had been similarly used by Weinstein et al., and how little choice they had either. So, the two periods spoke to each other quite resonantly in my mind. Leslie, were there aspects of Sabrina's Teardrop which you felt resonated with things happening in the 21st century?
Only, I think, generally you've got the disparity between poverty and the people with money and the people without, which was broadening at the time. I think general attitudes, where you've got a slightly one of the supporting characters, Mary Roper, she's quite feisty and trying to sort of to buck the trend, but it was very much still a man's world nonetheless. There was quite charitable works were setting up, and people were trying their best, and you had but there were still people that would prey on the poor. And of course you had things. I think one of the great unfortunate things about modern life is the grip that gambling has on people. You see it every day and everywhere. And again, that was something that that the whole issue of gambling features in Sabrina's Teardrop. In the one particular instance, of course, it ties around dogfighting, which is a modern thing. And to be honest, because I tend to try and research everything, I had to do some fairly unpleasant research in looking into it. I don't mean by attending a dogfight, I can assure you, but there were things to look into.
Hasn't gone away, has it?
Hasn't, no.
No, no, very unpleasant. And that the way that you showed the kind of the bloodlust in some of those aristocrats, those very well-off people, I thought that was well done, because we tend to think of dogfights as being quite a working class thing, and you were showing how actually no, bloodlust is bloodlust, and it cuts across all strata of society. Chris, obviously you're writing about history that's easier to relate to in a way, because it's still virtually within living memory. Are there pitfalls because of that? Because it is within living memory?
Yeah, there's in its way, I mean, the research is easier because there are still people that one can speak to who experience the war. But I mean, that in its way is the pitfall, because there are a lot of people who still know what happened in the war, and there are a lot of people who still know what has not been told about what happened in the war. And it's we of course, straight after the war, as usual, history was written by the victors, and so we had all this spate of films, and we still have this rather skewed image, particularly here in Britain, of the history of the Second World War, and that image sort of continues. And so it's rather hard to try and pull it back and try and say, well, actually, it wasn't really like that. It was a desperately appalling time through which to live. It wasn't all heroics. It wasn't all wonderful. I mean, in the case of the resistance, there's this idea that the Germans entered Paris on the Friday, and on the Saturday everyone got up and blew up a train. Well, they didn't. I mean, that whole occupation brought out the best and worst in people. And it's sort of, I think one of the things as well, when you write about that period, one of the things that I think, as someone who grew up in Britain in a safe country, wondered how would I have behaved under those circumstances. And we can't know, and may we never know. But it's I think that's the thing that we try to question. It's all too easy to fall into the Hollywood heroics and histrionics, whereas what I think is far more interesting to try and look at what it was like actually living in that time, what the social history was, what it was like queuing for bread, what it was like just trying to get by, just trying to keep your job. Which I mean, if you think, I mean, sort of when the Germans entered the city, there were 100,000 unemployed in Paris. Within 3 months, there were 600,000 unemployed. So I mean, it's those social problems that's recent history, but it's something that we don't really know much about. And I think it's that sort of history that is important for me to try and remind us of and to try and keep alive.
Yeah. So you're talking about the kind of nitty-gritty day-to-day stuff rather than political history and military history. How did people on the ground, literally on the ground, actually live? And that was one thing I was thinking about when preparing for this evening. Lots of people always say to me, "Oh, I wish you had maps in your books." So let's have a think about how we actually convey the physicality of our geographical locations. Leslie, I found your descriptions of 1890s Shrewsbury really, really vivid. I felt like I could navigate my way around just following your books. Did you have old maps to base your descriptions on?
The town, largely being medieval, hasn't changed a huge amount. But yeah, I use ordnance survey maps, and in fact, in the Pontypridd books, I tend to put ordnance survey maps in there, which I have to go to the local library for and take them and print them myself. Sort of thing. That way, I'm going to pay a copyright. So I do use those, but yeah, there's parts I had to understand. So I managed. I put in I follow Shrewsbury Town Football Club, and I thankfully there was a way I could fit them into the plot, but I didn't know where the football ground used to be, and I had to look on the Ordnance Survey map and found it was near the barracks, which was slightly the town. So I do always look at maps, and I try and get it right. You can't get it right every time, but I do my best.
Yeah, I was really fascinated to see in your historical note that football match actually did take place. That was a nice touch, I thought.
Yeah, it was. I read the entire report of the match in the newspaper of the time, and it was frankly fascinating with the goalkeeper getting kicked in the head, but
Yeah,
carried on playing because they weren't allowed to have substitutes.
yeah,
So,
something else I didn't know. Yeah, really, really, really interesting. Yeah, the way you wove that into the plot, I really liked that. Andrew, the end papers of the hardback of The Shadows of London show a map of 17th century London. How important was it to you to get the geographical things in your book right, as well as all the political and historical stuff?
Well, the map on the end papers of that series is the Hogarth map, which is a contemporary map of London showing the extent of the fire. The only problem is, because of the way it's been reproduced, it's more or less illegible. It needs to be much larger scale, obviously. I find maps are absolutely crucial to my research,
Mm.
and indeed to anything I write, because even if I make up a setting, I will often make up a map to go with it. I think I need maps on a sort of fundamental level, as a baby needs a bottle. Because it's sort of, I think setting is so important. You've got to know your setting before your characters will work, before the narrative will work. Luckily, there are a number of very good 17th century maps available. I mean, this was the decade, or the century rather, when urban cartography began to take off. Some of them are incredibly large scale. I mean, I'm hoping I'll reach the 1680s one day, because there was a 1680s map maker who does this incredibly detailed house by house map of London, which will be a joy to work with, I know. And so yes, maps are crucial for me.
Chris, I know you've recently come back from Paris, haven't you?
Tough.
Yeah, somebody's got to do it, haven't they? I mean, to my horror, I realised when thinking about this, I don't know how much of Paris was destroyed during the war. I kind of assumed not a lot, because the Germans just sort of marched in. Is Paris now as it would have been then?
Very much so, certainly in the centre. Because I mean, Weygand declared it an open city, so that the city wasn't bombed. It was, but the outskirts were bombed by the Allies. The Boulogne-Billancourt, the Renault factory on the outskirts of Paris, was bombed by the RAF. But no, most of the city remained intact. So I mean, I am walking streets that were there. At that time, in the streets that Eddie would have walked down. I mean, a few things that you have to be careful with is the street names changed, obviously, because I can't suddenly have Eddie going to the Place Charles de Gaulle.
No.
And so that I have this fabulous book, which is Dictionary of the Streets of Paris, a French book. And it goes through giving a little history of each street, of every single street in Paris, what its original name was, when it changed its name, what have you. Because, of course, there are lots of streets, squares, what have you, named after resistance fighters and politicians since the Second World War, and writers. So you do have to keep a very wary eye on that. And there are buildings that have gone. I did find one the other day that it's a building that is held up with wooden struts, and I found old photographs of it, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if that's still there? And I went, and it is still there, and it's still held up by wooden struts. But then there are other buildings that have gone. There was, in the book I'm writing now, the fourth book in the series, there's an auction house that used to have this fine old 19th century building that was replaced in the 1970s. So I went to look at it, and I had to hold the picture up in one hand and look at the building this way to try and picture it. I mean, coming to maps, there are all sorts of maps, and there are lovely French websites with lots of maps. But the most curious map I found was when the Germans entered the city, they drew up a tourist map for their soldiers with all the sites in the city marked on the map where the soldiers should go. And they brought out a magazine every week. Yeah, they brought out a magazine every 2 weeks with the best restaurants and the best places for them to go. And that map it's a very bizarre thing to see.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? It's as if they weren't an occupying force, as if they were sort of there on holiday.
They had there was a tour company and it was called Jeder einmal in Paris. Everyone should visit Paris once. And so all the soldiers, or no matter what front they were on, were given a 2-week leave to go and visit Paris.
Goodness
Certainly in
me.
the early days of the occupation, it was really bizarre. They regarded it as a playground.
Wow. Leslie, Andrew, did you find anything like that? Any books which told you what places were like at the time? You know, from a kind of, oh, you must see this, or I mean, any kind of original source which talks about places. Did you
I
find it?
remember I wrote a book called The Second Midnight in the 1980s, which was recently republished actually, but it's largely set in Prague. Um, Prague just before World War II and during. And I found guidebooks to late 1930s Prague, and I plundered those for places and restaurants and bathing stations on the river, and it was that was extraordinary. You felt I could have leapt on a tram, had the right money in my hand, and gone to exactly where I wanted to go. And it's almost as if you're sort of living in the time. You must have felt the same, Chris, I'm sure, with your German Paris guidebooks. That sense you're seeing the city through the eyes of these people.
Very much so. And then these were young soldiers who maybe came from a farm in southern Germany or something. It was suddenly they were an occupier. They were an Aryan occupier in this city that had been turned into their playground. And you had, I mean, on the very first weekend of the occupation, the ice cream sellers came out and the German soldiers were buying ice creams. It was just totally absurd. It was almost surreal, some of the things you saw. But it's also that whole idea of there was the guide to the city, but it was a guide to a city that they had corrupted. So a lot of the things that they wanted to see, they couldn't see. So some of the sites were covered in sandbags that they'd put up. So they were telling their soldiers, go and see this site. All you'll see is sandbags. It was just the most bizarre thing.
My main contemporary, sort of access into what people thought at the time, what was going on, really is from newspapers. And I've read so many of them, but it gives you, whether it's the report of who's appearing at the music hall and what the reception was like, or if there's a civic function, where people were staying, council meetings where they were trying to attract people to the town. I mean, one of the things there is, I mean, I'm going down for a book launch next month. Well, in the town itself, there is one little boutique hotel, and yet the thing that in the council meeting we were having this argument, the one said, "Well, you know what we're paying for? It's the quality of our hotels." There must have been about 15 hotels in the town of top quality, and so. But yeah, I get my kind of feeling from that, and I also was fortunate to find in Shrewsbury not so much an account of what some of the places were like from somebody from about 50 years ago who wrote one, but there's some lovely old photographs around, and there are websites where you can look, for example, at Pontypridd or Cardiff or whatever. There's so many of these groups on Facebook now where they will publish photographs, and you can, if you spend the time doing it, which obviously takes you away from writing, but you can glean an awful lot from that.
Absolutely. While we're on the subject of research, I was thinking, have any of you found out something which really surprised you when we were doing research, or maybe took your book in a different direction because of something you'd found? Chris, you're nodding away. Go on, tell us.
Sorry, yes, constantly, and there's nothing like research for telling you how little you know and how many assumptions I've made. And it's sort of like the second book, Paris Requiem. There were two main strands in it. I knew one, but I knew it very superficially, and I discovered just how little about that I knew. And the second strand was just a complete surprise to me. I hadn't realized it was about prisoners going missing. Prisoners went missing. French prisoners went missing from a prison in Paris. And the reason why and what that eventually evolved into was dreadfully sinister and dreadfully opaque. And so it was things like that that really surprised me. So I mean, I find it can give you a great big strand like that, or even the whole book, or just little vignettes. I discovered another one I discovered, and it's coming out in book 3 as well, because I've discovered a whole load more. Was a series of rumors that were doing the rounds when the Germans entered the city. And these bizarre things like the Pope had moved to Avignon again, and the British paratroopers had parachuted into the city and were cycling up the Champs-Élysées. And so they were just things that I would never have been able to make up in a million years. They were real rumors that were doing the rounds. So that meant I had to create a character who would spout these rumors at Eddie every time he waylaid him on the stairs. So it's that research, as you know, is fundamental. I mean, it's very often it's the parent of the story. It's fundamental to pretty much every part of what we write, I find.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was surprised by some of the court cases, and I think the one thing that shocked me, and it hasn't really come into my books yet, but it really did, was the number of cases of infanticide, of babies just abandoned, or and this, that, and the other, and not just the famous murder cases like Amelia Dyer, but the murderess, but just ordinary people, ordinary young women who'd got into trouble and then basically, put them to one side. And in fact, what would happen is that they would be arrested on the basis of murder. But inevitably, they would actually change the charge to one of neglect. Or failure to record a birth if they didn't know it had breathed. And they would get 6 to 12 months in prison with hard labour. Very few hanged. It's why they fetched in the actual, because there wasn't an act of infanticide in law. It was straightforward murder. In 1922, they made infanticide because that way it didn't necessarily automatically carry the death penalty. So that sort of thing. But various other sort of aspects. I mean, I give talks on the late Victorian age, and of course, one of that is to completely dismiss some of the absolute nonsense that gets talked about in terms of things about the prudish. They had to cover up chair legs lest people be offended, and I know Alice, you write in the same period. And then I tend to shock the people there by saying, well, you do know what the age of consent was when Victoria came to the throne,
exactly,
which was 12. And of course, when they did initially put it up in the 1870s, they thought that was ridiculous, so they put it to 13. So all this, Alice, I know, but so there's things that you came across in legal cases, and you think, that's quite amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. Reading court cases is an absolute eye-opener, isn't it? Yeah. Andrew, what about you? I mean, obviously, you're delving into much deeper history. Were there things that you discovered that you just didn't know, and which surprised?
Well, I think I'm in a constant state of amazement. I'm permanently finding out things I had no idea about. The deeper you delve into sources, the weirder and more surprising they become. To go back to your point about newspapers, Leslie, I've also written a series set in the 1950s, and my main resource for that, and full of the unexpected, was local newspapers. Particularly the small ads. I found they were often incredibly revealing about what people wanted, how servants, so many of them are about servants, aren't they? Obviously servants were a particular trial to a lot of aspiring middle-class housewives. Yes, all that surprised me. The detail of people's lives you could infer from a close study of local newspapers. Unfortunately, in the 17th century, there were no real local newspapers in the sense we would understand them, and no real national newspapers, although there were news sheets were beginning to develop. But for there, my main resource tends to be letters and diaries, that sort of thing. Personal. You can't beat first-hand reminiscences or first-hand viewpoints. And that's where you find these little snippets of information, these things that take you by surprise and think, oh, I could use that. There's a lovely piece in Pepys's diary, which I haven't used yet, where Mrs. Pepys has caught Mr. Pepys in a compromising position with one of the maids, and she is understandably extremely cross. And that night, when he's asleep in bed, she comes to him with a shovel full of glowing coals and threatens to take away his manhood. It's an extraordinary passage. I haven't used it yet, but one day I will find a way to do so.
The marvelous Mrs. Pepys, how
I
fantastic!
know, what a lady, what a lady. It's a shame she died young.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, of the three of you, you're the one, Andrew, who includes most real people in your books. Is that a problem for you in getting? Oh, it's difficult to say getting people right, but I mean, how hard do you find it representing real people, and do you feel it to be a burden trying to do them justice?
I think, yeah, it is. It's something I try to take quite seriously within the confines of fiction. I don't like to make them do things they wouldn't have done, or to do things. Yeah, you can see the point I'm trying to make. I try to make my fictional versions consonant with the historical record.
Yes.
But having said that, the best historical personages to use are ones we don't know very much about. Then you've got leeway to make things up. I discovered this. I wrote a book about Edgar Allan Poe's boyhood in England, in the Regency England. And the great joy of that was there was lots of information about Regency England, of course, but there was almost next to nothing about the young Poe, the boy Poe, when he was, I don't know, 11 years old, which made him, I could invent him on the basis of his later fiction.
Yeah.
I could invent things that might have led eventually to him writing this or that poem or short story. But he was entirely fictional almost, because there was very little information about him at that period of his life.
That sounds brilliant. Somebody asked me the other day, they were quite convinced that I'd based Basil in my current series on somebody real, and I had to point out to them that I never based my characters on real people.
I'd assume Basil was real. Well,
no.
Did have some sort of correlation within history.
No, absolutely not.
And all your own doing, all your own creation.
He's my very own.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you guys base your characters on real people? I mean, whether they're famous or whether they're not, or do they just go into the kind of what I always describe as the subconscious soup of my brain, and something comes out?
Chris? If we're talking about supporting characters, then they tend to be, I've done it a couple of methods, but by and large, I usually start off with somebody I knew, perhaps at school or when I worked in an early job, or this, that, and the other, and then I morph them into something else. So for example, one of Chard's drinking mates is Dick Jenkins, a bit of a little shady poacher type character, and I worked in a factory for a few years after leaving school. And there was a charge hand there who was, shall we say, exceedingly shifty. And he used to walk like Flash Harry from the St. Trinian's films, with his long overall on. And he'd open up his car boot at lunchtime, and he'd be full of gold watches and leather coats and things like that. And he was always looking shifty. And I started with him, and then I thought of the character in the Titfield Thunderbolt, the old poacher in that, and I sort of merged them into the two. And so quite a lot of it, there's usually a bit of somebody I know in most of the supporting characters, but nobody is sort of close enough to be pointed out, although somebody has once and they were completely wrong.
Chris, what about you?
Well, I'm actually, yeah, I have to introduce certain characters who were part of the Nazi setup in Paris at the time. So in the third book, Otto Abetz, who was the German ambassador, who was a Nazi and who, died in the wall, Nazi party member, who claimed to be a Francophile, and he would try to win people over to his cause, and he wanted to get rid of what he regarded as the dregs of French society and bring over the upper echelons to his side. And so he appears in the book. I mean, he's trying to tempt Eddie of all people to the dark side. But it's, I mean, again, and as Andrew says, you have to be very consistent, constant with their characters. So I mean, I did to try and get his character. I read lots of material about him from both his detractors and his supporters to see what he was like. And you sort of you glean these things about him, that he was very charming but had a dreadful temper. And so, you can bring that out to try and sort of create a real version of the character, even though I'm putting him in a situation in which he never was, because Eddie didn't exist. But I mean, there are other problems there. I mean, I had the sort of the whole idea for book 3 planned out, and there was this real character that was going to make an appearance in the book. And then just as I was getting ready to write the book, I discovered he wasn't actually in Paris at the time that I was setting the book. So that was real back to the drawing board moment, with lots of swear words flying around the room.
You really you take it that seriously.
Yeah. No, this character. I mean, the third book is set between December the 12th, 1940, and January the 6th, 1941, and he left Paris at the end of November and didn't return until the March. So I couldn't have him in that book. So that had basically the villain had to change. And that villain then became made up, whereas it was going to be this real character.
Okay, interesting.
So yes, I mean, because it's that element that it is recent history, I can't play quite so fast and loose.
Yeah.
I can't have a character in Paris if there's evidence and a historical record that he or she was somewhere else.
Yeah. And I guess because it's so recent, we do have that evidence. We do know.
Yeah, we do, yeah.
Yeah, and woe betide you if you get it wrong. Somebody will be hauling you over the garden.
Someone will know. Yes. Yeah.
And of course, we do sort of meld, as you were saying, Leslie, drawing from characters we've met in real life, using them as the foundation for fictional characters, and sometimes feeding them into historical personages as well when we want to enrich them as characters. But talking of this thing about using real people as fictional characters, there's this wonderful story about Frances Trollope, the mother of the more famous Antony, who was also a novelist, and she was once asked whether she modeled her characters on real life, on people whom she knew. And she said, "Yes, my dear, of course I do, but you would never recognize the pig in the sausage."
Oh, that's brilliant.
I would like to say there is one cat, because from Sabrina's Teardrop, I think people might have liked Barney the dog. And I've got to say, he's actually the dog in the pub that's about 100 yards away. And that's definitely him.
To bring us back down to earth. Time is dashing on as ever. Just before we go over to Bev, one last question from me, if you don't mind. I'd like to just one of the things which obsesses me in my fiction is getting the language right, by which I don't mean making pastiches of 19th century fiction, but just putting in enough to suggest 19th century prose. How do you make your language fit your books? I mean, Andrew, you're the furthest away. Obviously, you haven't gone in for 17th century dialogue, because goodness, that would have been terrible. So how do you do it? Because it's, you do convey the period really, really well.
I think something happened to the English language in the late 18th century, and it became almost recognizably modern, what we now think of as modern educated English. I've written first-person narratives from the point of view of a late 18th century character, and it's a, reasonably plausible pastiche of how people would have spoke at the time. And I thought I could do the same with the Restoration period. And I wrote, I think, about half a page from in a first person narrative in a sort of a very clumsy pastiche of a 17th century voice with the vocabulary and the syntax and so on. And it was appalling. I couldn't understand it.
No.
So I gave up on that one. But what I use is the Hilary Mantel method, which is you use good plain modern English, but occasionally you throw in a construction, a word, a bit of syntax that is actually authentically 17th century, which conveys the flavour.
Yeah.
I think it's not a perfect solution, but it's as near as we can reasonably get. Because we have to let our readers read, don't we?
Precisely, yes. You can't keep pulling people up with difficult syntax or unfamiliar vocabulary. I agree. Chris, I know you work really hard at this. Do you want to talk a bit about?
Yeah, well, I have a different problem because, of course, it's set in the 1940s, obviously, but I have French and German characters. I'm writing in English, conveying what French and German characters are saying in French and or German. And so I have a different problem. I can't use English vernacular from that time. I can't have my lovely French detective saying "toodle pip, old chap." So I have to find almost an atemporal, ageographical language. I try not to be anachronistic. I try not to have them come out with phrases that simply weren't around at that time. I wrote one in the last book, and that Eddie says that someone had put down a marker, and then of course I thought that doesn't sound right. And I looked it up, and that was coined in the 1960s. So I can't do that. So I have to try and find an English that is fairly timeless, but that does not have very obvious neologisms that simply weren't around at that time. And of course you then also have to try and convey. When I write the German speaking French, I write them in a very stilted formal English, whereas Eddie and the French characters speaking French speak in a more natural English, so to speak. I mean, it's supposed to be French, but it's English with contractions, with slang, with colloquialisms, but again, trying to be timeless.
Yeah, and it's very, very effective. Leslie, yours is equally effective. What are your tricks that you can share with the audience?
Well, first of all, I think particularly in the first book, it was slightly stilted, a good way of putting it, really. And I think I put in the back of the book, so I kind of thought I'd better qualify this because, of course, you go to Italy or France, and you go to Italy, say, and you say, thank you very much, and you automatically say prig or you're welcome. It's much more formal. You always say good day when you go into a shop, and which is something, of course, we've lost in the English language. And so it was quite formal, the first book. I've lessened it perhaps a little bit since since then, but I think that's useful to get across. You've got to make it slightly stiffer than you would normally. You can't go down some of the slang terms that they used. If I was to write that a policeman caught a couple doing the bear, then what does it mean? Well, it means just having a hug. That's all it meant. But you can't use things that people just wouldn't know what the heck they meant. One of the biggest traps, kind of mentioned by Chris, but I think it's more of a problem for me, are sort of some of the colloquialisms, which I can't think of any off the top of my head, but what I find an awful lot of things that actually were invented in the 1920s. The 1920s seems to be a decade when they came out with all sorts of things that we hear today.
Yeah.
And certainly after the First World War, there seem to be a lot of things that caught on. So those are difficult. I'm constantly checking that I don't do something, wrong like that. But I try and keep it a little bit formal, remembering that people who had a status in society would react that way, and also not to fall into some of the Victorian stuff, which again is all London based, and it's watch your governor and all that of
absolutely
does my head in. So so trying to keep it, but again, the ones in South Wales, I can use the odd little valleys not necessarily Welsh, but Valley's terminology that we use, which has been around since time immemorial. And in fact, in the Shropshire one, I used some there, though not a lot, because, you know, that would have been perhaps a bit difficult if I did.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I think we'd better introduce Bev Jones with some questions from the audience. Otherwise, I shall have my knuckles wrapped. Hi, Bev.
Hello.
Yeah.
We've been having a great chat in the chat stream. We've got a lot of questions for you. We probably won't get through them all, but we'll work our way through and see how far we get. Okay, so the first one is from Louise, and she'd like to know, how long does it take you to research one of your novels on average? And how do you know, once you've gone down that rabbit hole of all the cultural and history, how do you know when enough is enough and you need to start writing?
I'll tell you when I find out.
Yeah, exactly.
But I have to. It's awful. I mean, research. There's always an undertone of research. It never goes away because you're constantly researching as you write. But I actually set myself a date. I give myself 3 months to research before I start writing. And the problem then is it's only when you start writing that you realise what you need to know. And the last book, I gave myself 3 months to research. I sat down to write, and the very first paragraph I had to stop because there were two things I didn't know that I needed to go and research. So it's, you have to be quite strict. I set myself a time, but I do research 1 day a week while I'm writing the book,
Right.
because there's that constant, it's like a buzz underneath that you're constantly researching, I find.
What about you, Andrew? How do you manage?
Well, I rather like Chris, actually. I mean, at the beginning of a book, I do a certain amount of research, you know, to get the framework and to get an idea of how the story can work with it. And often the story is partly generated by the research. But the trouble with research is, as we know, it's the ultimate rabbit hole, and you've got to call stop. I'm much less organized than Chris. I think I don't have a day a week when I'm writing, when I do research, but I do ongoing research all the way through the writing of the first draft, and then more in the second draft. It's the only way to do it, because otherwise, I do know some aspiring authors who never start, but they just research. So it's a real pitfall, which luckily all of us have avoided.
Gerald, do you find that you've got so much research sometimes, and there's so much interesting information you'd love to put in there, but you can't because it's not adding to the story?
Yes, that does happen. I mean, the way I go about things is I don't necessarily have to follow a particular historical incident, but if I know it's going to be in the book, that's when I will spend maybe a month doing things like that. But the big issue is when I'm initially starting to say, right, what sort of story am I going to write? And sometimes I might, for inspiration, look at court cases. And last year, I'm afraid I got totally entangled in an unsolved murder. I spent 3 months trying to work out, looking at all the police reports, everything, trying to solve this crime and decide, well, who do it? And then I thought, well, I can then write the story about that. I'm afraid I've failed, but I am going to use it as a basis of a contemporary novel, maybe next year. But there we are.
Research, it's never wasted.
That brings us quite nicely onto a question by Helen, because she'd like to ask you all, which came first for you when you were thinking about writing either your first novel or the first in a recent series? Was it the place and time that specifically interested you? Or, like Leslie, was there a case or an incident that incited that interest?
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll go with that. With me, it was a case of I read historical novels for quite a long time. Medieval mysteries are the ones I like personally, that I like to read. And I thought, well, I'd like to try and write one. And my inspiration came from a picture on the wall, which is my grandparents' wedding in Pontypridd in 1898. My grandfather was Italian. And I decided to try and, well, I wonder what the town was like in 1898. And so I managed to get a reference book, and I suddenly found, you know, what was an absolutely superb sort of setting to set the murder mystery. And that was it. So really, that was the inspiration that got me into writing about that period.
Right. Anyone else?
As for me, the first of my restoration series, The Ashes of London, that started because I read Pepys's account of the Great Fire, and I thought, I can work with this. It's just such a vivid account of this extraordinary conflagration that swept through London, and it was full of dramatic incidents and little details that brought the whole thing alive. And I thought, I want to know more about this. And often I write a book because something in the research makes me want to find out more about it. So I think, I'll write a book about it then.
Mine was really notions that had stayed in my mind for years. Years ago, I did my thesis on the French resistance, and it was the notions of resistance and collaboration, and the dividing line between them, and the nuances and the blurred lines between them. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to explore how one would find oneself forced to one side or the other, which then gave me the time, because Paris was the obvious place in which to set that. So it was more the notions of resistance and collaboration.
That's interesting, because you've touched on that, and Andrew touched earlier about the Me Too sort of explosion and the way that affected his work. But Gwenllian would like to ask, how do you manage in your books attitudes that were acceptable at the time, but are obviously out of date now, without perhaps alienating your reader and still making your central characters sympathetic enough? I suppose especially the male characters, because they're the ones that would have a more prominent historical role traditionally.
That's a minefield for all of us. It really is. I mean, how do you make even halfway acceptable to a 21st century reader 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, even 20th century ideas of class, race, sex? The whole thing. It's terribly difficult, and the way I do it, and it's only a partial solution, is I try to not pretend these things weren't there, but to make my viewpoint characters, my more sympathetic characters, at least question or feel less enthusiastic. I've got, for example, in the recent one, The Shadows of London, slavery comes into it, and one of my main characters is interested in it, but not convinced it's a good idea. It's so hard to do. I don't know what the right answer is to that.
It is very challenging, isn't it? Because we see with TV and films, and even films from the 80s and 90s now, they've got trigger warnings on them and warning people, attitudes acceptable at the time, which perhaps isn't a bad thing. But what do you think? Leslie, you were going to speak then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have now for my next book that's coming out, and I've actually put on the front. I can't remember if I did it on Sabrina's Teardrop, but I've put, this is a novel of the late 19th century, and for reasons of authenticity, some of the characters may reflect attitudes that. Etc. So it's a disclaimer at the start, which kind of you've got to do, and I think that is the way to do it, because if you were to write something acceptable for the feelings of this century and our modern life, then what you'd be doing would be hiding what happened in the past, and I don't think that does anybody any good. If we were to write a book, and if Andrew was to write the book and it didn't have slavery in it, it almost gives the impression of, well, there was no slavery, so there was never a problem. So I think you've got to put those things in. I must admit, one of my books, I think it was the first book, I've always been very pleased to have some lovely reviews from professional critics. I'm really grateful for them. But one did make the comment that most of the women, the problem I have is that most of the women in this book are housewives, or they are, got lesser roles, or they do. And I'm thinking, I never answered to it, because obviously you never answer a critic, but It was the 19th century. I'm sorry, that's what it was. But what I do, of course, I fetched in. I do have a supporting character who's quite feisty, who's a lady, and you know, and hopefully I'll try and bring it through that. And I've got a book after next. There's quite a few lady characters who are very, very strong. So yeah, but to just hide it and pretend that those things weren't there, I think is completely the wrong thing to do.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. As Andrew says, it is a minefield because you do have, on the one hand, you have to try and remain true to the period you're writing about, but then you do have to be acceptable to a modern day reader. And so, I think that the idea that you then have your likable central characters questioning the mores of the time, I think is actually a good way to go about it. But I mean, another thing I would say as well is, what are the ideas of today? I mean, they go from one extreme to another. To say that everyone thought the same way in a certain period in history, I think is wrong as well. I mean, you are going to have people from the Restoration period, from the 1890s, from the 1940s, who would possibly have more modern ideas than a lot of people around today. So I mean, I think it's justified in creating that broad church of attitudes, even in historical periods.
Yeah.
I think we're almost out of time. Do we have time for one quick one, or?
I didn't think so.
Okay, there you go. We could have talked forever.
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry. We'll all turn into digital pumpkins if we stay much longer, I'm afraid. So it only remains for me now to say thank you to Bev, our question monitor, to the audience all over the world for joining us, and to Chris Lloyd, Leslie Scase and Andrew Taylor. Don't forget, next year's festival will be in Aberystwyth from the 25th to the 27th of April, so keep your eyes on the website and we hope to see you there. Meanwhile, from all of us, goodbye for now and good night. Hwyl am y tro a noswaith dda.